There are stories so dark they seem almost beyond belief, cases that rattle even seasoned detectives and leave entire communities reeling. The case of Arthur Brown Jr. is one of those rare stories, a grim reminder of how a single night can forever change the lives of so many. Tonight, we take you through the crime that left 4 people dead, the years of courtroom battles, the final meal, and the last words of a man who maintained his innocence until the very end. But before we start, ask yourself, how do we weigh justice against the possibility of doubt? Can a system built on evidence and testimony ever be truly infallible? Walk with us through the details and decide for yourself what you believe. Arthur Brown Jr. was born in 1970, raised in a world where options were often limited and trouble was never far away. Growing up in rural Louisiana, he watched friends and family get swept into cycles of poverty, crime, and addiction. Teachers remembered a quiet, thoughtful boy who sometimes drifted off in class, a kid who seemed to carry worries beyond his years. As a young man, Brown found himself drawn into the underworld of drugs and fast cash. The late 1980s and early 1990s were a time of chaos in American cities, and Houston, Texas was no exception. It was there that Brown's story took its darkest turn, a turn that would send shockwaves through the city and haunt families for decades. By his early 20s, Arthur Brown was already on law enforcement's radar. He was a small-time dealer, moving back and forth across state lines, always looking for the next big score. But those who knew him say he kept a low profile, no flashy cars, no high-profile lifestyle. He blended in, but the decisions he made would soon bring him under a spotlight he could never escape. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening in a small brick home on Brownstone Lane, in a working-class neighborhood of southwest Houston. Inside, the house was filled with the rhythms of daily life, laughter, music, and the clatter of plates at dinner. But as night fell, everything would change. The home belonged to Jose and Rachel Tovar, a hard-working couple who had come to the United States to build a better future for their children. With them that evening were Audrey Brown, a close family friend, Jessica Quinones, the Tovar's pregnant daughter, and Frank Farias, Jessica's fiancé. There was nothing remarkable about the gathering, just family and friends, sharing a meal, talking about the future. But outside, danger was approaching. Arthur Brown Jr., along with 2 accomplices, Marion Dudley and Antonio Tony Limon, had been planning a robbery. The house was known to be involved in low-level drug transactions, and Brown believed there was cash and drugs inside. But what began as a calculated plan quickly spiraled into one of the most brutal crimes in Houston's history. Armed and desperate, Brown and his crew forced their way inside. They demanded money, drugs, anything of value. The family was terrorized, herded into the living room at gunpoint. What happened next remains chilling even after all these years. 4 people, Jose and Rachel Tovar, Audrey Brown, and Jessica Quinones, were executed, shot at close range. Jessica was 8 months pregnant. Frank Farias survived, but only because he played dead, waiting for the intruders to leave before crawling to the phone to call for help. The crime was over in minutes. Brown and his partners fled, leaving behind a house soaked in blood and a city reeling from the brutality of it all. Houston police arrived at a scene that would haunt even the most hardened investigators. The victims lay where they fell, family photographs scattered among shattered glass and spent shell casings. News spread quickly. 4 people dead, 1 a pregnant woman, another left for dead. The Tovar home became the epicenter of a wave of grief and outrage. The surviving witness, Frank Farias, told police what he remembered: faces, voices, fragments of a nightmare. The city demanded answers. Detectives worked around the clock, piecing together evidence, following leads through Houston's labyrinthine underworld. Within days, their search led to Arthur Brown Jr. and his known associates. The case against them grew quickly: eyewitness testimony, physical evidence, and a web of connections that all pointed back to Brown. The city's fear turned to fury. Brown, Dudley, and Limoni were soon arrested in Alabama, hundreds of miles from Houston. The extradition was swift. Houston wanted justice. Arthur Brown Jr.'s trial was a media spectacle, drawing reporters from across Texas. The prosecution laid out its case with clinical precision, showing the jury crime scene photos, ballistic evidence, and the testimony of Frank Farias, who recounted, through tears, the night that destroyed his family. Prosecutors argued Brown was the ringleader, the one who orchestrated the robbery and decided no witnesses could be left behind. They called it cold-blooded, premeditated murder. The details were harrowing. How Jessica Quinones had begged for the life of her unborn child, how Rachel Tovar had pleaded for mercy. But in the end, mercy was in short supply. Brown's defense team fought to sow doubt. They argued the evidence was circumstantial, that police had focused on Brown because they needed a culprit, not because they found the truth. Brown himself denied being the shooter, insisting he wasn't even in the house when the murders happened. He admitted to knowing the others but said he'd been set up. But the jury saw things differently. After weeks of testimony, they returned with a guilty verdict on capital murder charges. The sentence, death. Brown would join the ranks of the condemned at Texas's notorious Polunsky unit, waiting for the state to decide when his life would end. For more than 30 years, Arthur Brown Jr. sat on death row. The world outside changed, but inside Polunsky, time moved slowly. Brown's case became the focus of activists and legal groups who saw flaws in the system. They argued the investigation was rushed, that police had relied too heavily on the testimony of traumatized witnesses, and that new forensic evidence could cast doubt on Brown's guilt. Brown's appeals wound their way through state and federal courts. His attorneys raised issues of intellectual disability, claiming he lacked the mental capacity to be executed. They cited inconsistent statements by surviving witnesses and argued that the state suppressed evidence that might have cleared him. As the years dragged on, Brown remained adamant. He was innocent. In interviews and letters, he maintained he hadn't pulled the trigger, that he was railroaded by a system more interested in headlines than truth. Each denied appeal only deepened the sense of injustice felt by his supporters. But for the families of the victims, the appeals were agony, a reopening of wounds that had never fully healed. The Tovar and Quinones families carried their grief quietly. Birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays passed in silence. For them, justice had a face, Arthur Brown Jr., and they watched as the legal process crawled along year after year. By early 2023, Brown had exhausted nearly every legal avenue. The courts rejected his final claims, and the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles declined to recommend clemency. Brown's execution was set for March 9, 2023. In the days leading up to his death, Brown spent his time in the small, windowless cell he'd called home for decades. Guards checked on him every hour. He read the Bible, wrote letters to family and friends, and prayed with the prison chaplain. His legal team filed last-minute appeals, arguing again that his intellectual disability should spare him from execution, that key evidence hadn't been considered, and that doubts still remained about his guilt. Advocacy groups, including the Innocence Project and Amnesty International, released statements calling for a stay. The case gained traction in national media, another death row story marked by doubt and controversy, but the courts remained unmoved. The day before his scheduled execution, Brown's final requests for a reprieve were denied. The state prepared for the inevitable. In keeping with Texas protocol, Brown was allowed to request a final meal. Unlike in the past, when inmates could choose elaborate dishes, Texas now serves the same meal given to all prisoners. Brown's last supper was simple: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread, and sweet tea. He ate quietly, lost in thought, surrounded by the routine noises of prison life, a guard's footsteps, the distant clang of cell doors. He spent his remaining hours with the prison chaplain and spoke briefly with his attorneys. He called his family, speaking in soft tones, offering apologies, prayers, and words of love. "Keep your heads up," he said. "Don't let anger define you. I love you, always." As evening fell, witnesses for the execution gathered at the Huntsville unit. Among them were members of the victims' families, journalists, and prison officials. The mood was somber, no celebration, just a long-awaited reckoning. Shortly after 6 p.m., Arthur Brown Jr. was led from his cell to the execution chamber. He moved slowly, his body marked by decades behind bars, his eyes scanning the faces behind the glass. The fluorescent lights glared off the sterile white tiles. Guards strapped him to the gurney, inserting IV lines with clinical precision. The warden asked if he had any last words. Brown turned his head, his voice steady and clear. "What is happening here tonight is wrong. I am innocent. The evidence was not heard. The world needs to know I did not do this. I pray for all the families, for peace and for justice. To my family, I love you. I am at peace." He paused, looking through the glass at the witnesses, some weeping, others stone-faced. "We all answer to God in the end," he said softly. "Let the truth come out." The drugs began to flow, first a sedative, then the lethal injection. Brown closed his eyes. Within minutes, his breathing slowed, then stopped. At 6:37 p.m., a doctor pronounced him dead. For a moment, the room was silent. The ritual was over. The scars, for those left behind, would remain. Outside the prison walls, darkness had settled over Huntsville. Reporters filed their stories. Protesters held up signs, some decrying the execution, others insisting that justice had finally been served. For the families of the Tovar and Quinones households, the execution brought a measure of closure, but not peace. No sentence, no act of law could restore what was taken that night in 1992. Their grief remains, a private ache marked by public tragedy. For Brown's supporters, the case is a rallying cry, a symbol of a justice system that can fail, that sometimes chooses certainty over truth. They promise to keep fighting, to clear Brown's name, even after death. In the end, the execution of Arthur Brown Jr. is more than just a crime story. It is a cautionary tale about the limits of law, the danger of certainty, and the wounds that never truly heal. The story of Arthur Brown Jr. is not just about crime and punishment. It's about the lives forever changed on a single night, the years of pain that followed, and the enduring questions that justice alone can't answer. Was the right man put to death? Can the law ever truly offer closure? Or do some tragedies leave behind only doubt and regret? Now, it's your turn to weigh in. Was justice served? Should doubt ever halt an execution? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story made you think, subscribe to our channel because behind every headline is a story that deserves to be heard, no matter how dark or complicated.